rabbits are their favourite prey. As many people know, rabbits have multiplied across Britain, so they're found everywhere. How a buzzard catches a rabbit is quite often it will spy from up high in the sky or from a perch, and because its eyesight is more than 6 times more powerful than ours, they then drop down and either pin the rabbit to the ground with their talons, or they will pursue it in a low-level chase. Of course, buzzards, like other birds of prey, can leave their nesting territories to find food, but can also share hunting grounds with others of their kind. However, roaming buzzards can run into trouble with other birds. As you can see, one here is being harassed by a couple of crows, and that's all down to the crows are all joining forces to drive off larger predatory birds like buzzards by just mobbing them, dive-bombing them and squawking at them. And the practice is known as mobbing, and it quite often is just to drive the buzzard away from their nests. And of course, how buzzards work as parents is quite often the female will stay at the nest incubating the eggs, or when the eggs hatch, she will stay at the nest and protect and feed the chicks while the male hunts for food. And when the chicks are small, prey can quite often be brought back into the nest and fed to them piece by piece. But when they get bigger, a whole rabbit can be brought into the nest and left for them to tear apart themselves. Of course, despite the past misfortunes of the buzzard, they are no longer an endangered bird. I mean, there are thousands of them across Britain, and they remain to this day to be our most common and one of our most magnificent birds of prey. And of course, as you can probably see here, this is how you tell the buzzard and the 2 eagles apart. Buzzard, as you can see, is a lot smaller. Golden eagle is bigger than the buzzard, but of course the white-tailed eagle is of course the largest of the 3. Here is the range of the buzzard. As I mentioned, they're Britain's most widespread bird of prey, so they're found pretty much all over Britain and Ireland. Now the next animal I'm going to show you is one of my favourite garden birds. It is the starlings. Starlings often divide opinion, as not everyone's fond of their boisterous, noisy behaviour. But while many people consider them to be just loud, boisterous and irritable, I personally think that they are some of the most beautiful birds. Here is like their winter plumage, where they're black with white spots and a dark beak, but in the summer their beak turns yellow and their plumage has beautiful purple and green in them, so it is absolutely stunning. Of course, starlings are found across many habitats of Britain, but unfortunately, like most other birds, starlings have been in decline since the 1970s, especially in farmland areas, which is mainly due to new farming practices that have driven them more and more into urban areas. Of course, like their human neighbours, large flocks of city-dwelling starlings can be noisy and messy, but they are a very beautiful sight when they fill the skies with in a vast flock when they either depart from or return to their roosting site. And in fact, there's actually a few places in Britain where you can actually see starlings flock together. One place that I know of that I have been to see these is on the Somerset Levels, and they flock together like this. And that's actually called a murmuration, and it is one of the most beautiful sights. Of course, recognising a juvenile starling can be a little bit tricky. I mean, they have none of their parents' darker or speckled colour. In fact, they're actually a nondescript greyish brown with a darker area around each eye. But when the juveniles start to molt into their adult plumage in autumn, they can appear a bit patchy with the adult plumage on the bottom half, but still retaining the greyish brown juvenile plumage on the head, neck and upper breast. Starlings are quite often the most common birds to come to feeders in gardens. Of course, they can feed on like birdseed as well as scraps of food that humans leave out, but they mainly feed on invertebrates like worms, beetles, spiders, insects and insect larvae. Of course, adult starlings don't migrate, but in starlings, I mean, some birds, like the juveniles, will travel further away from Britain to make sure the population is more spread out. Some even get as far as France, Belgium or the Netherlands. Of course, adult starlings, when it comes to winter, they don't need to travel very far because they don't really need to. In fact, their ability to help them find prey, as well as the food we leave out for them, allows them to continue to live through the winter while many other birds have just given up and flown south. Of course, while many people don't share my opinion of starlings, to me they are some of the most adorable and quite funny birds, because whenever I see them in my garden, they're quite often fighting over who gets to be at the best part of the bird feeders. It's a little bit funny, to be honest. But if you ever do see starlings, they're quite often in a squabbling group of birds on a rooftop or in a garden. While they're very sociable birds, their presence with each other often ends in frequent quarrelling. Oh, another thing about starlings is that they can nest in trees, but they can also nest in buildings or even underneath a pier at a beach town. So they can live pretty much anywhere. Because here is their range in Britain. Of course, as you can see, they do tend to visit the Highlands of Scotland in the summer. Now, the next animal I'm going to show you is another one of our birds of prey, which is also the world's master of hovering. It is the Kestral. Now, Kestrels are in the falcon family. They're actually our second smallest falcon, in the smallest being the merlin. But of course, as you can see, they do look very different to the male and the female look different to each other. In fact, this one here is a male. You can tell he's a male because he has a blue head and tail, but also, like in all raptors, he's usually smaller than the female, but the female is all brown. And when I said about kestrels being the world's master of hovering, that's all down to because one thing they do really well is that they can hover in exactly the same place without even moving their head and not even beating their wings. In fact, they purely use the wind, and that's mainly down to what they feed on, because a lot of what they feed on are field voles and mice, and they actually have a scent a special sense in their eyes which allows them to see in UV, which means they don't just see their prey, but also their urine. Of course, they can follow the trail, the glowing trail, to where a vole is, and then they lock onto their target and dive down, and then pow! They catch their prey. And of course, they usually nest in like a hollow tree or on a cliffside, but they can nest in human-made boxes that are made for them. And of course, kestrels were also another bird that was used in falconry. Of course, it was the only bird that the knave, who was at the bottom of the pecking order in medieval times, could fly. And of course, as I mentioned, the kestrel mainly feeds on field voles and mice, so I mean, if you go and skin a mouse, there wouldn't really be much left to eat. And of course, well, many of you will probably know kestrels from the movie Kes, which was based on the book around the late 1960s, and I've never seen that film before, but I've heard it is a fairly good film, but I don't know, I've never really seen it. And of course, kestrels aren't endangered at all. There are hundreds, if not thousands of them here in Britain, and they are seen on many occasions. In fact, they probably are second or third most common bird of prey. And of course, if you were a vole, then this animal would be your worst nightmare. Of course, here is their range in Britain. The next animal I'm going to show you all is probably our most common and widespread. It's not a predator, in fact it's actually a herbivore, but there are dozens of these across Britain. They are the rabbits. Now, rabbits aren't originally native to Britain. In fact, they were actually brought over by either the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, or possibly the Normans a few thousand years ago. Of course, they have since then spread across all of Britain because, as many people say, breed like rabbits, because rabbits breed a lot. And while they aren't predators, they are herbivores, so they mostly feed on grass and leaves, well, any plant matter, but occasionally they can sneak into a farmer or a gardener's vegetable patch and get at their vegetables, a bit like Peter Rabbit, who was one of the characters that Beatrix Potter made. Of course, as you can see here, there's a difference between a rabbit and brown hair. Of course, another difference between rabbits and hares is that rabbits dig burrows, and quite often a whole group of rabbit burrows is called a warren, and there can be dozens of them living underground, and it's where they mostly raise their young, called kittens. And of course, there's usually one male rabbit called a buck, and of course he quite often keeps the right to mate with all the does, the females. Of course, when I said about rabbits being prey animals for all kinds of predators in Britain, I mean they're preyed on by weasels, stoats, foxes, badgers, and of course birds of prey like the eagles, the buzzards, and hawks. And that's all mainly down to the fact that if there weren't any predators, then rabbits would just eat themselves into oblivion, because they'd eat pretty much everything and they'd basically just run out of food. In fact, probably the most famous example of that was in